You ever stop and think about what a simple battery and a massive industrial metal refinery could possibly have in common? Well, it turns out they both run on the exact same fundamental principle, the absolute magic of electrochemical cells. These are just incredible devices that convert chemical energy into electrical energy, and sometimes the other way around.
So let's look at these two side by side. On the left, you've got a cell that's just bursting with energy, ready to give it away. Think of any battery you've ever used. But on the right, you have an industrial process that's actually consuming power to get a job done. In this case, purifying metal. They seem like total opposites, right? One gives power, one takes it. But as we're about to see, they're really just two sides of the very same electrochemical coin. So let's dive in and unpack this.
Okay, so even though they have completely opposite functions, both of these cells are built on one single unifying idea. At their very core, they're both powered by a special kind of chemical reaction that's all about one thing: moving electrons from one place to another.
And that reaction has a name. It's called an oxidation-reduction reaction, or just redox for short. Now, the best way to think about this is like a mandatory partnership. You can't have one without the other. One chemical has to lose electrons, we call that being oxidized, and another chemical has to gain those exact same electrons, and that's called being reduced. That simple handoff of electrons is the engine that drives everything we're going to talk about.
All right, first up, let's meet our power-giving hero, the galvanic cell. You might also hear it called a voltaic cell. Honestly, you can just think of it as its own little miniature power plant, turning a chemical reaction directly into useful electricity.
So what's the secret sauce here? Well, the redox reaction inside a galvanic cell is spontaneous. That means it just wants to happen. It doesn't need any coaxing or any external push. The best analogy is a waterfall. The electrons start off at a really high energy level, and they just naturally flow downhill to a lower one. And as they make that journey, they release a steady stream of energy, which we see as an electric current.
Let's break down what we're looking at. See those two separate beakers? We call those half cells. Inside each one, you've got a solid piece of metal, an electrode, dipped into a special liquid that can conduct electricity, an electrolyte. The wire connecting them at the top is like a highway for the electrons to travel from one side to the other. But what about that weird-looking U-shaped tube in the middle? That, my friends, is the unsung hero of the whole operation, the salt bridge.
And you would not believe how important this little bridge is. Without it, the whole reaction would grind to a halt almost instantly. Why? Because as electrons rush from one side to the other, you'd get this massive charge buildup that would stop the flow. The salt bridge is like a traffic cop for ions, other charged particles, letting them move between the beakers to keep everything electrically balanced. It's what allows the electron highway to stay open for business.
And now for our second character, the electrolytic cell. If the galvanic cell was a graceful waterfall, the electrolytic cell is a brute force water pump. It doesn't generate power. No, it uses power from an outside source to force a chemical reaction to happen that would never ever occur on its own.
This cell is all about driving a non-spontaneous reaction. So let's go back to our waterfall analogy. This is the equivalent of making water flow uphill. Yeah, that's just not going to happen by itself, right? You need a powerful pump to do the work. And in our case, that pump is an external power source, like a battery, that provides the energy to shove those electrons against their natural will. And this diagram shows a perfect real-world example: purifying copper. That external battery we see is our pump. It forcefully yanks electrons away from that big slab of impure copper on one side, the anode, which causes it to slowly dissolve. Those copper ions then travel through the solution over to the other side, the cathode, where the battery pushes electrons back onto them. And what you get is beautiful, pure 99.99% copper plating out. It's an incredibly powerful process.
Okay, let's get ready to tackle what is, hands down, the most confusing part of electrochemistry for pretty much everyone. I'm talking about the mystery of the sign swap. You know how the positive and negative labels on the electrodes seem to flip-flop between the two cells? Well, let's finally clear that up once and for all.
So let's just put the question right out there. How on earth can the anode, the place where oxidation happens, be negative in one cell, but then suddenly it's positive in the other one? It feels like it breaks the rules, but I promise you there's a perfectly logical reason for it.
This table just makes everything crystal clear. I want you to look at the first row, where it says anode process, and then the third row, cathode process. Notice something? They don't change.
Oxidation always happens at the anode, and reduction always happens at the cathode, no matter what. The only thing that's flipping is the charge, the plus or minus sign.
And here it is, the solution to the whole mystery. It's all about who's in charge. In a galvanic cell, the spontaneous reaction is in charge. It creates a surplus of electrons at the anode, making it the negative source. But in an electrolytic cell, the external battery is the boss. It hooks its positive terminal up to the anode to pull electrons away, which means the anode itself becomes positive. So it's just a question of whether the reaction is making the charge or the charge is making the reaction.
So, if you remember only one thing from this entire explainer, please let it be this. Forget about the plus and minus signs for a second. Just burn the definitions into your brain. The anode is always where oxidation happens. The cathode is always where reduction happens. That is the one rule to rule them all in electrochemistry. It never, ever changes.
And hey, if you need a little trick to help that stick, here's a classic mnemonic that students have used forever. Anox and REDCAT. Anode, oxidation, reduction, cathode. It's a simple little memory aid that will keep you from ever getting mixed up.
So this isn't all just abstract diagrams and theory, right? Let's talk about how this stuff actually shows up in the real world, because these cells are, quite literally, the power behind so much of our modern lives.
A perfect example is electroplating. It's a classic electrolytic process. Let's say you want to coat a boring old fork with shiny silver. You make the fork the cathode. You use a bar of pure silver as the anode. Then you apply an electric current, and just like we saw with the copper, silver ions leave the anode, swim through the solution, and plate themselves onto the fork, giving it that beautiful, protective finish.
And really, the applications are just everywhere you look. On the galvanic side, you've got every single-use battery you've ever bought. On the electrolytic side, the list is even crazier. Purifying metals, coating everything from jewelry to car bumpers, and even splitting water to make clean hydrogen fuel. It's a huge deal.
And what about the ultimate combination of both worlds? Well, you're probably holding it in your hand or it's sitting in your pocket right now. A rechargeable battery. When you're using your phone, the battery is acting as a galvanic cell, spontaneously giving you power. But when you're playing it into charge, you're forcing it to become an electrolytic cell, using outside power to reverse the reaction and store that energy up for later. It is a device that truly lives a double life.
But as amazing as all this technology is, it's not perfectly efficient. There's a hidden challenge, a sort of energy leak, that scientists and engineers are constantly battling to try and fix.
And this challenge is called overpotential. The best way to think of it is as an unavoidable energy tax. See, in theory, a reaction needs a very specific amount of voltage to run. But in the real world, you always have to supply a little bit extra to get it going. Or you get a little bit less out than you were hoping for. That little bit of extra energy is just wasted, lost to the universe as heat.
This chart shows the problem perfectly. That bright blue bar on the left, that's the dream. That's the 100% ideal energy we should get, according to the physics. But the dimmer red bar on the right, well, that's reality. That's what we actually get. And that gap between the two, that's the energy tax we're paying. That's the overpotential, just bleeding away as wasted heat.
And this energy tax isn't a small problem. It exists in every single battery, every fuel cell, every industrial process out there. So the big question, the multi-billion-dollar question for our energy future is this: how do we lower it? How do we invent better materials and cleverer designs to shrink that gap and build a much, much more efficient world?